Hello lovely future ancient historians, welcome to your second lesson on the Trojan War and how it's represented in the Iliad. So if you can write down the title and the aim, and then on the first screen you've got two quite well known things to come from this. Obviously you've got this cartoon image. What I'd like you to think about is, have you come across this before? Do you know the story behind it? And think about as well how we use it in a modern context. And then the second one is still quite a commonly regarded phrase, even though it is over 2,000 years old. And this is the line, "Beware the Greeks bearing gifts." So you don't have to submit this, but just for your own peace of mind and a good starting point, can you just jot down what you think these two refer to, what are the meanings, and why is this? Think about this as a starting point for what we're going to look at next. So, just to give you some context and a little bit of background detail, obviously, as the title suggests, we are looking at the Trojan War. The Trojan War is arguably one of the most famous events in the ancient world. Now, what we mean by this is not necessarily the most famous event to happen pre-zero or in the BC period. Obviously things like the assassination of Julius Caesar are probably far more well known to us now than the Trojan War or the details of the Trojan War. But what we mean by the most famous event of the ancient world was, this is the story that without doubt almost every single man, woman and child living in the ancient world, whether it be Greece, Rome, Egypt, anywhere in the Mediterranean, they would know this story. And they would know this story particularly because it's one of the few continuously told stories in this ancient world. This would have been the bestseller for hundreds of years. Everyone would have read it as a child. Certainly people like Alexander the Great were massive fans of the story of the Trojan War. And even to the people in, say, ancient Greece in 500 BC or Alexander the Great in 300 BC, the events of the Trojan War to them seemed very much how we regard the ancient world. It was still a very long time ago, very, very far away in terms of time, but it had some of the common echoes that we see when we look at ancient history. There are certain elements of humanity that remain, and if we think about that kind of enduring story through this time in 1200 BC was a long time before people like Alexander the Great, but it's even further back for us. So this is a little bit of context about the world at that time. So when we talk about the period of 1200 BC, we don't necessarily refer to the people involved as the ancient Greeks or classical Greeks. We are particularly talking about what are known as the Mycenaean Greeks, from Mycenaean Greece. This is an archaic part of history, very old and very different to a lot of what we'll study later on when we get to the Greeks. Mycenaean Greece mainly grew out of the southern part of Greece. It's a series of small cities rather than actual countries, and they are very scattered across the land. So this is kind of the very origins of ancient or archaic Greek civilization. So the first question then is, who are the Mycenaeans? So like we've said before, these people lived in mainland Greece from about 1600 BC. Now this massively predates things like written records from Greece or the Greek alphabet, and certainly the archaeology that we have is very limited, partly because the problem you'll find with archaeology is that good places to live in the ancient world are also good places to live in the modern world. So we tend to build cities on top of other buildings. So it's likely the classical Greeks of 500, 400 BC also built their cities on top of the ruins. There are some exceptions though. So we do know that the Mycenaeans particularly lived in walled cities on top of hills. These were called acropolises or acropoli, They're clearly built on top of hills surrounded by walls as a fortification, which gives us some idea of how wild and roguish Greece was at the time. And the biggest of these and the most famous was the city of Mycenae, which is in southern Greece. You can still go there now. We do take the sixth formers to Mycenae, and it is quite spectacular. This was the capital of the Mycenaean Greeks, and this is where they get their name from. Like later city developments, we see that the rich lived inside the city walls in their permanent fortifications, in their townhouses or palaces, and the people living down the hills were the poorer people, the farmers and so on, because obviously you need the land to rear your animals. So without any written record or any real kind of alphabet at the time, we obviously need to look at archaeology to find out about who the Mycenaeans were. And this is one of the things that we talked about in the general introduction, that you're going to have to get your head around, this kind of mixture of history, archaeology and literature and art history, because ultimately ancient historians have to look at all of them. So that's what we're going to do here. So we're going to start with the archaeology. The archaeology from Mycenae is somewhat plentiful but also somewhat limited, and this is not unusual for archaeology in general. So one thing we do have, as we said before, is the city-state of Mycenae itself. And if you look in the top left corner of this screen, you will see a very nice aerial photograph of the Acropolis at Mycenae. From it we can tell the sheer size of the fortifications. When you go there, the rocks that make up the walls are absolutely enormous. They're easily 6 feet tall and just as wide. They are massive things. So this is a very, very well built fortification. This would tell us that the Mycenaeans obviously were pretty good with engineering. It's a sturdy construction. They've obviously had some form of mechanism or machinery to move these stones and rocks, and they've got skilled craftsmen. The archaeology also, if you look at the bottom right hand corner, the reconstruction, gives us some idea of the kind of the buildings of the Mycenaeans. Obviously this is a reconstruction, but we can see these kind of generally 1 or 2 story buildings. In the middle you've got the palace, which would be called the Megaron, and this is called the Megaro for some reason. But we've got all kinds of smaller houses as well, so we're looking at 1 and 2 room houses largely. Just next to the reconstruction of the palace, we see some of the things you find in places like Mycenae, and this is a picture from the museum at Mycenae, just next to it. When we say there's a lot of things we find, there are, but they're very, very specific. So obviously we see, anything like this, you see a lot of kind of funerary objects, so things people were buried with. So we've got a couple of swords there at the front. You'd be thinking, well, that's really useful. We can tell what they use, blah, 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 for fighting and so on. Actually, no. These are probably more decorative than normal. The materials they're made out of gold and so on. So people wanted to be buried with their finery. Similarly, all the cups and the ornaments behind, these are funerary objects. Now, it does tell us that the Mycenaeans were pretty skilled metalworkers and skilled craftsmen, but we don't really have a lot of detail about what else they did. Similarly, when it comes to things like conflict and war, we see at the top you've got a little illustration of a fragment of pottery that was discovered at Mycenae, and clearly it shows soldiers going to war. Now this is only a little vase painting and afterwards a sketch, but we can say from this piece of archaeology, this at the time description, if you will, we can see certain things that we hold common to the Mycenaeans. So the soldiers are marching, spears are the preferred weapon, they have large shields and very stylized helmets. And then we get to one of the most famous pieces of archaeology found at the site of Mycenae, and this is the golden mask of Agamemnon. Now, Agamemnon was one of the characters or one of the key Greeks who was involved in the Trojan War. And this is supposedly, or when it was discovered, this was hailed as his funerary mask. But there are problems with archaeology, as we're about to find out. So this mask was found in 1876 by a quite now notorious German archaeologist called Heinrich Schliemann. Schliemann was very, very famous at the time. He was seen as one of the greatest archaeologists of his age. The problem is that Schliemann didn't necessarily take an evidence-based approach. So as you see on the slide, it says this was originally believed to belong to the famous king who led the Greeks against the Trojans in the Trojan War. Unfortunately, we know that this cannot be true because, as we have dated this, it's from 300 years before the Trojan War. So this is definitely not the golden mask of Agamemnon. The problem with Schliemann, and he did this when he went right throughout Greece, he famously claimed to have found the Minotaur's Labyrinth and so on, or the Palace of King Midas. The problem with Schliemann was he had read all of the ancient literature, and when he went to Greece to excavate, he went looking for specific objects. So when he dug something up, he instantly associated that with what he'd read about. So whilst this is a funerary mask of a Mycenaean king, it's not the mask of Agamemnon. However, to Schliemann, because he was so desperate to find proof that Agamemnon existed, in his mind there was absolutely no doubt that this was the mask of his favourite Mycenaean king, Agamemnon. So sometimes we have to be very, very careful with understanding archaeology. So, super duper little quick task. It shouldn't take you very long. It's more a thinking task than a writing task. So, from the information you've just seen, and you may need to rewind the video and watch it again, sorry, I want you to create two lists. The first one is, what kind of things can archaeology tell us about the Mycenaeans? Try and give specific examples as well as the broad pictures. And then I want you to tell me, what are the problems with some of the archaeology? Why can't archaeology tell us everything we want to know? So just make two lists. This is going to be one of the things I'd like you to submit back into the Google Classroom. I don't mind what format you do this in. Bullet points are fine. Simply two lists. What can the archaeology tell us? And what are the problems with it? So, back to the main event, the Trojan War. So, the Trojan War is by far the key event of its age, the key event of Mycenaean Greece, and arguably the entire archaic world. This is the story everyone knew. This is the story that was the benchmark for all acts of heroism, valour, and great deeds in the ancient world. Every general wanted to be an Achilles, or every general wanted to take a city like Troy. Everyone wanted to be noble and heroic and have the great skill of those involved. So it's become a really good example for starting with ancient history, because ancient history ultimately becomes this blend, this mixture of myth and reality, and we'll come back to this idea later on. Things become more glamorized and fantasized about more than they actually deserve, where the idea of the event becomes more important than the event itself. So the Trojan War, we do know, did happen in 1200 BC. We do know there was a conflict there round about this time. We do know the city of Troy did have significant fortifications, because we do have archaeology to support that. And we do know at some point the walls did come down, but we don't really know why. So before we get into that picking apart myth and reality and its representation throughout history, let's start with some basics. So on the next few slides, I'm going to very quickly talk you through the build-up to the causes of the Trojan War. So all I want you to do on a page, on a PowerPoint, however you wish to do it, just create a quick timeline of the causes of the Trojan War. And again, this is the second task I'd like you to submit back into Google Classroom. So our story starts, as we've said before, in 1200 BC, in and around the Aegean. So at this time in the world they lived in, the cities of Greece and in the east Troy were the greatest powers in the ancient world. Particularly we see Troy on the right hand side, and on the left in southern Greece we see Mycenae and Sparta. These were the main players in the ancient world at this time. So if we look at Troy, the city itself, and apologies, the images are taken from the not great film Troy, which is why Orlando Bloom is sat there at the bottom. So Troy itself in 1200 BC was ruled by the king Priam, and he has two sons, Hector, his eldest son, and Paris, his youngest son. And the two most powerful states in Greece were also ruled by two brothers. So the most powerful ruler of Greece and the Mycenaean king, who Schliemann famously hoped he'd found the mask of, was Agamemnon. He was arguably the top dog in Greece. He was amicably supported by his brother Menelaus, who was the king of Sparta, who is, as you would probably expect, notoriously warlike and always up for a scrap. So we're told the next stage of the story is that Priam from Troy sends his sons to Sparta for a festival. This is a bit of ancient diplomacy. This is how you'd make good bonds with your rivals and make sure they didn't become enemies. You'd go to their parties, they would host you, you'd all be friends together, and you'd build these bonds of friendship. Priam obviously would need to stay in Troy, and if by all accounts he was getting a bit too old to be sailing across the sea, so he sent both of his sons to Sparta to enjoy this festival and to build good, strong relations with the Greeks. Clearly that did not happen. So whilst in Sparta at this festival, in the house of one of the angriest men and hardest men in all of Greece, Paris, Priam's younger son, the young prince of Troy, manages to charm Menelaus' wife, a woman who at that time is known as Helen of Sparta, and she's supposed to be the most beautiful woman in the entire Greek world. And so after the party, after the festivities are done, Hector and Paris return to Troy. But it turns out, and this is revealed to Hector in the middle of the sea without him knowing, turns out they've got a special guest on board. And yet Paris has convinced Helen to leave Menelaus and come to Troy with him so she can be Helen of Troy. So needless to say, when he wakes up, probably with a terrible hangover, once he finds out his wife is missing, Menelaus is not best pleased. He's even less pleased when he finds out she has now been declared Helen of Troy, princess of that city-state. So, as you do, he is out for revenge. Now, even though Menelaus is the kind of angry guy who'd probably just get in a rowboat, sail over to Troy and start attacking the city on his own, he's not playing around. He wants to make Troy fall now. He wants his wife back. So, even though he's a powerful king, he goes to the one man in Greece who's actually more powerful than him, his brother. So Menelaus asks Agamemnon to help him take revenge and form an alliance with all of the other Greeks, and actively declare war on Troy. So, not just because he's trying to help his brother out, Agamemnon agrees to declare war on the Trojans. Now, interestingly, of all the characters in the Iliad, which talks about Troy, and in the coverage of ancient Troy, it's Agamemnon who really comes across as the bad guy, because he's the only guy who doesn't have a worthwhile motive. Alright, Paris is a bit of an idiot. He runs off, steals someone else's wife, and then manages to get everyone he knows into trouble and ultimately dead. Hector is the greatest, the most complete man. He's the father, husband, defender of his people. Achilles is a rage-driven war machine. Menelaus has got reason to fight. He wants his wife back. But Agamemnon doesn't. He's just in it for the scrap. He just wants to see Troy fall and its people burned. So he's kind of the soulless bad entity in all of this. He's calculating, he's cold, he's not driven by any kind of emotion necessarily other than his own pettiness. He just wants a bit of a scrap. So once he agrees to this invasion, then we get the line that 1,000 ships set sail from Greece to Troy. And obviously these ships filled to the brim with lots of angry Greek soldiers. Now with these Greeks doesn't just come a bunch of really hard Greeks. They bring their ultimate weapon. With the Greeks comes Achilles, and there he is in the middle, Brad Pitt having bulked out to be Achilles. Achilles is the unbeatable warrior of the ancient world. He's half man, half god, an all-round badass. He's a well-known character in the ancient world. He's arguably the kind of pin-up boy for anyone who wanted to go into the army or serve well. He is undefeatable, and he's all about glory. He's not just there for the scrap, he's there for the greatness of his name. What we know about Achilles is famously his mother Thetis dipped him in the river Styx and made him invincible, except his ankle. But Achilles also suffers from this very, very ancient, very, very Greek dilemma. He's given a choice. He can live a long, happy life, live into old age, but fade into anonymity throughout history. He will live, he'll be happy, but after he's died, no one will know of him. Or, so that's route A, or he can choose route B, where he will live a great and glorious life, and people will sing songs and write books and tell tales of his achievements for the rest of time, and we still are doing. But the payoff with this is that he will die young. So realistically, if you think about Achilles and his motivations as an individual, he's just trying to live his best life and get the most out of his exploits to give something to make his name echo throughout history. Either way, the Greeks think this is a massive benefit to them. The Trojans not too keen on Achilles and his Myrmidons turning up on their shores. And long story short, this invasion then leads to a 10-year war between the Greeks and the Trojans. It's not a short thing, it lasts for 10 years, it's a bit on and off. The Trojans are sat in the city behind the walls, the Greeks are sat on the land, sacking and pillaging, and every now and again trying to attack Troy. And it obviously ends with a well-known wooden horse. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that now. And if you think the story of the wooden horse is a bit far-fetched, when we look at things like the Iliad and, well, not even contemporary, ancient accounts of these events, there's an extra layer. The gods are involved. So we've got a few examples of the gods on here. We've got Zeus in the middle, who basically spends most of his time trying not to get involved. On the left, we've got Athena, the goddess of wisdom, who is obviously backing the Greeks. On the right, we've got Hera, Zeus's wife, and Aphrodite, his daughter, who are backing the Trojans. And it's not uncommon in some of the ancient literature, definitely, for the gods to play an active role. They'll swoop down from Mount Olympus and get involved. And at various points in the story of the Trojan War, as told by Homer, this definitely happens. Aphrodite comes and saves Paris from being completely scrapped up by Menelaus. Apollo gets involved. Ares, the god of war, ends up on the battlefield. The gods play quite a significant part in the story. So then that leads us nicely to our final task, task 3, and this is something, again, I want you to submit back to the Google Classroom. Now, it's not just within the tales of the Trojan War that you'll see various references to gods and gods doing things. Certainly when you start with the kings of Rome, according to the Romans, the gods had a direct hand in founding the city. The Greeks have similar stories about their cities and so on. And the works of Homer, particularly in this case the Iliad, is no different. Now, the Iliad is arguably the longest written account of things like the Trojan War and of this period in existence. It is a work of fiction, it's an epic poem, but for us what's important is the context of which it takes place and some of the detail. Obviously the bits with the gods in we cannot take at face value, but it tells us something about what the ancient people would have thought about. Homer wrote the Iliad apparently in 750 BC, and it does tell, to some extent, the story of the Trojan War, or it tells us of the people who, according to the ancient Greeks, were there. So this was a very, very well-known story, and it's important that we start with him and this idea of mixing archaeology, myth, and a bit of literature to try and work out some history from this. Because ultimately we have to. This is what we've got. So on the Google Classroom you will find a printed extract. This is a summary of the main events of the Iliad, which is set during the Trojan War. It'll give you a nice little overview of the story. I've also included some extra bits in at the end to try and give you a bit of closure and a bit of clarity, because you don't actually get that in the Iliad. It sort of starts as it stops. So simple task. All I want you to do, and again you can do this digitally or you can just take pictures of your work, but I do want you to submit this. First thing, and it's only a little task, I simply want you to highlight the mythical parts of the story. Now these are pretty obvious. Also, if you think there are any parts of the story that are highly unbelievable and more tall tales than historical fact, can you also indicate that? Then I want you to write a brief answer, very short answer, and it's bearing in mind everything we've said about mixing archaeology, history, mythology and literature. Do you think the Iliad is useless to historians? And can you justify your opinion? You may think it is very useful, you may think it's not useful at all. I want you to make a judgment about whether this book is useless. Should ancient historians be reading and studying this work of fiction from 750 BC to make judgments about the Trojan Wars? So once you've done all those things, there are only 3 short tasks. Can you upload them back onto Google Classroom so we can feed back to you, and then next week we'll carry on with some more craziness from the ancient world.